Here's a guy who thinks atheism is a cult that's ruining science.
I mean, you heard about it, and some people claimed it as a label, but by and large, atheists weren't common. At least not commonly heard. Maybe they didn't speak up so much back in those days. The catalyst for atheism coming out into the world seems to have been twofold. One would have been the whole World Trade Center thing, and the other one was the invention of social media.
What gets called the New Atheist movement was largely a reaction to that, but it took off a bit before social media really started to have a lot of influence. Sam Harris's book, The End of Faith, was published before Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube were ever invented, and Dawkins's book, The God Delusion, was published just after YouTube started, but still before Facebook or Twitter.
It kind of seems like, you take MySpace and you add the World Trade Center to it and you get Atheism Plus.
Atheism Plus lasted for like a week in 2013, which was long after most people stopped caring about MySpace. Atheism Plus was an attempt to make an explicitly progressive feminist atheist movement that fizzled out pretty quickly, but lots of folks still complain about it.
After 9/11, the level of tolerance for religions in general seems to have dropped off by quite a bit. And just a few years later, social media was giving more people than ever the ability to communicate without being face-to-face and thereby dealing with the repercussions of their words. And this led to people sharing their opinions much more overtly than previously considered socially acceptable.
Shouldn't that benefit people with unconventional ideas that they want to share?
So we had a perfect storm, and it exploded onto the internet and into our homes. With this ideology taking hold in pop culture for the first time, we had a new wave of celebrities. Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Aaron Ra, and Matt Dillahunty were popular as actors in the field of atheism already, but social media increased their reach exponentially, and they gained numerous colleagues, or brothers in arms you could call them. T.J. Kirk, a.k.a. The Amazing Atheist, and Philip Mason, a.k.a. Thunderfoot, led the pack.
Both of those guys were pretty hostile to Atheism Plus, by the way, especially Thunderfoot.
And numerous creators came along in their wake, mostly going after creationists and flat earthers. They also were using social media, and their arguments were available online and able to be picked apart. So we ended up with debunkers, and for some reason, most of them were either angry, insulting, or both.
A lot of that was for entertainment value, but those two guys look like Potholer54 and Greenman 3610, who largely debunk climate denialism, which is a serious threat. So I don't see it as particularly unreasonable to be angry at the people they debunk.
Now you could blame James Rolfe for this trope taking hold. The angry reviewer was a common thing for quite a while. But this did turn into a serious problem as the proponents for team science act emotional and replace proper research with insults and derision. It set the tone for other atheists to act similarly. And this has led us to a place where the people that claim to represent logic and reason and evidence and, empiricism act emotional and angry and really aren't very scientific at all.
Scientists aren't Vulcans. Being a scientist doesn't mean you never express anger, especially when people are denigrating ideas that have the strongest evidence behind them.
You could say the lunatics run the asylum in some ways here, and well, the problem is bad enough that I want to talk about it, and I'm an atheist. So, hi, my name is Dan, and I don't have a good name for this channel yet. We are going to call it Dan's Really Cool Internet Thing on YouTube for now. But, sit yourself down, and we'll talk about atheism and how it's ruining science.
Are you a scientist? Has your career been derailed by atheism?
Max Planck, a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, once said, "A new scientific truth does not triumph by convincing its opponents and making them see the light, but rather because its opponents eventually die and a new generation grows up that is familiar with it. An important scientific innovation rarely makes its way by gradually winning over and converting its opponents. It rarely happens that Saul becomes Paul. What does happen is that its opponents gradually die out, and that the growing generation is familiarized with the ideas from the beginning. Another instance of the fact that the future lies with the youth."
I'm very skeptical that this applies very broadly, if at all. Even the debunkers on YouTube are often very clear about what evidence they would need to see to convince them that the ideas that they find most convincing are false. I've lost count of how many times I've explained what evidence would convince me that God exists or that Jesus had resurrection powers. There are even claims that I don't believe that I would love to be convinced are true, like the view that climate change isn't really happening. There are few things I would more like to see than convincing evidence of that. I'd also love to see proof that aliens really crash-landed in in Roswell. That would be awesome. The mere fact that I think there's no good evidence for something, or that there is strong evidence against it, does not at all mean that I am hostile to being convinced that it is actually true.
He said this back in 1950, and it's often summarized as science progresses one funeral at a time, not one discovery at a time, and it's called Planck's principle. Now, Planck was a Nobel Prize-winning physicist. He knew what opposition was in the scientific community, but this was a long time ago. So you can say that this opposition to change is not new. But the skeptics that Planck dealt with were within his field, and a few well-informed journalists are someone like that. But today, somebody offering a hypothesis that is equally counterintuitive to modern physicists' knowledge not only face an army of colleagues opposing them, they face outsiders who know little of the topic but speak authoritatively, often with derision, and this bears an emotional toll on the person who brings out these new hypotheses, sometimes more than they can bear, and obviously that's going to stop some people from saying things that they're afraid will get them slapped down.
This is a common argument that creationists use. They say that the only reason creationism isn't taken seriously by scientists is because they push anyone who suggests it out of the scientific community. Although this is the first time I've ever heard anyone say that people are too afraid to suggest innovative hypotheses because they're afraid that debate bros on the internet will make fun of them.
And let's be fair, anything important is going to be something that is going to get pushback. All of the big discoveries, by definition, require accepting new information and rejection of old beliefs that were once considered knowledge, once were considered quote-unquote proven science. So this is a difficult position emotionally for the people that have wrote papers, wrote books, taught their students that this is truth, because they have to admit that potentially their life's work was in error.
It's very common for scientific papers to list their limitations and express caveats in their conclusions. Arguably, Stephen Hawking's most famous idea was Hawking radiation, which he originally thought was released by black holes at random, which would mean that black holes destroy information. He later calculated that it is not random and that black holes do not destroy information. This kind of thing is not uncommon. Scientists aim to find what ideas best fit the evidence. They are less concerned about protecting an idea just because they came up with it. Overturning old ideas only gets pushback if you don't have evidence against those ideas that's strong enough to overcome the sometimes centuries of evidence that is consistent with those ideas being true.
And that can make this a very difficult, very uphill battle for new discoveries to navigate through. But now it's harder for these people to do because they have public pressure to maintain the status quo from outside of their field, outside their institutions. But people who do have influence over both their colleagues and institutions through their online influence. And let's be clear, it has never been easy for the scientific community to admit they have been wrong about something big.
Nonsense. You don't make a name for yourself in science by simply repeating conventional pieties. Newton is as famous and celebrated as he is because he showed Aristotle was wrong. Einstein is as famous and celebrated as he is because he showed Newton was wrong. Einstein wasn't suppressed by the folks who had taught Newton all their lives, nor was Newton suppressed by people who had taught Aristotle all their lives. They were celebrated because they had the receipts, they had the evidence to back up their ideas.
From the peopling of the Americas to South American influence on Easter Island to quantum entanglement to germs making us sick, science has had a very unscientific approach to handling these sorts of things, coming out with a new hypothesis that is completely flying in the face of the quote-unquote proven knowledge is like hanging a stake around your neck and running around with a bunch of lions.
Horseshit. Once there was strong evidence that people were in the Americas before the Bering Strait crossing, that idea was no longer controversial. The South American influence on Easter Island has been accepted since the genetic evidence was shown. Quantum entanglement is only controversial among people who think that it is evidence that information is being sent faster than light. It isn't. And the idea that germs make us sick is also supported by the overwhelming preponderance of evidence. None of the consensus positions on these phenomena are unscientific.
You're going to get attention, and probably not the kind you want.
If you have the evidence, or at least the equations on your side, you'll get the best kind of attention.
For instance, I've recently become aware of a guy named Dave Farina, aka Professor Dave Explains. He's a chemistry teacher by trade, and one of the guys who made his mark mocking flat earthers mercilessly years ago. Now that gets old, and people quit watching, so now he picks at all kinds of people who aren't perfectly in line with their fields. Often I agree with the general position that Dave espouses. A lot of times I do feel like the person he's going after is talking pseudoscience. However, he also goes after people like Eric Weinstein or his brother Brett.
Those guys' ideas are not just mocked by folks on YouTube. They are subjected to perfectly sober, rational critiques from lots of scientists. In fact, Brett's insistence that ivermectin is an effective prophylactic for COVID is even critiqued by his brother Eric. Even he doesn't buy that shit.
Now, both have hypotheses that are not currently accepted by most of their colleagues, and both hypotheses are potentially groundbreaking.
Potentially groundbreaking is not a reason to accept a hypothesis. A hypothesis should only be accepted when a properly run experiment is done which corroborates it. The experiments with the biggest sample sizes have falsified the idea that ivermectin is at all effective against COVID. And Sean Carroll can explain why Eric's idea that he calls geometric unity hasn't produced convincing receipts.
I'm going to read this. This document is an attempt to begin recovering a rather more complete theory, which at this point is only partially remembered and stitched together from old computer files, notebooks, recordings, and the like, dating back to as far as 1983. And this is why this paper is not going to appear in the peer-reviewed literature. It's not serious. It's a dog ate my homework kind of thing. If you have a dark matter thing, if you have a dark matter prediction, if you have a dark energy prediction, I want to see a plot in the paper. I want to see redshift versus distance. I want to see a calculation of a relic abundance so I can figure out how much dark matter is supposed to be. If you do that, people will pay attention to the theory. It's very possible.
Sean, first of all, how dare you?
Now, I don't know enough about either of those fields to weigh in heavily, but I do know that there's a debate there. There is enough there that both men are convincing some of their colleagues, not just outsiders. So
they're not the only crackpots with degrees. Listen, I'm perfectly willing to believe that ivermectin works against COVID. The more effective remedies there are, the better. That's another claim I would love to see demonstrated to be true. Unfortunately, the strongest evidence all points in the opposite direction.
It seems to me that this is the kind of place that we should let the discussion and the evidence bear it out. But that's not what happens here.
Where's here? If by here you mean the internet, so what? I care what happens in the lab, and in the lab, the Weinsteins' potentially groundbreaking hypotheses simply don't pass muster.
These hypotheses are opposed by most and intriguing to a few.
Well, the ivermectin one was intriguing enough to get scientists to actually test it. It's rejected now because the experiments failed to corroborate it. What's unscientific about that? To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.